I'm going to start, as so many things do today, at these troubled times, with a picture of the sort of Ukrainian flag. I have lived my whole life in and around theatre buildings, and I'm a member of Opera Yorkâ, which is the professional association of opera companies across Europe. The opera companies in Kiev, Lviv, Kharkiv, and Odessa are all members of Opera Yorkâ, with Odessa having one of the most splendid opera houses in the world. Ironically, in 1940, the city of Odessa was besieged by the Germans and Romanians during the Second World War, and it was defended jointly by the Russians and Ukrainians at that time. The opera house was regarded as a gem, and the buildings surrounding the opera house had anti-aircraft guns on their roofs to defend it. Fortunately, it wasn't damaged during that war. Over the last couple of weeks, we have all grown to appreciate how inspired and bold the Ukrainian people are. However, I think the people who run the opera house in Odessa might be being a little optimistic, because their website at the moment advertises a new opera, Katerina, an opera based on the poem by Taras Shevchenko, for next Saturday evening. I think the chances of seeing an opera next Saturday in Odessa are probably extremely limited. I'm going to start with a Greek amphitheatre. I'd like to then move on and talk about an architectural competition that went awry. I'll move on to talk a little bit about opera houses and how they have changed or not over the last 380 years. That will lead on to talking about concert halls and rooms for music, and then into playhouses and other spaces. And I'm going to conclude by talking about the role of performing arts buildings in the city, and finally look at two theatre buildings, or two theatres I was involved in 2017. There is an unwritten law or regulation which says that anybody speaking about theatres and theatre buildings must start with a slide of a Greek amphitheatre. This is my slide of a Greek amphitheatre. It has no relevance to the rest of my talk, but I have now fulfilled the obligation to start with a picture of the ancient theatre in Epidavros. This is not a theatre. This is a TWA, Trans World Airlines 707. And in the late 50s and early 60s, jet aviation was taking off, and the world's major airlines were competing to distinguish their product and their flights from others. Part of this battle between the airlines took place at New York's airport, then called Idlewild, with a number of the airlines building their own distinctive terminals. Pan American built their Worldport. TWA decided they needed a terminal building, and they engaged Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen to design their flight centre, which opened in 1961 at what was then Idlewild and is now JFK Airport. This is probably one of the most attractive and inspirational airline terminals in the world. It evokes flight better than almost anything else could. It is no longer in use as an airport terminal. It's been renovated and restored as a rather elegant hotel. The gentleman on the right in this picture is Eero Saarinen, the architect for the TWA Flight Centre with its curvaceous shapes. On the left is Sir Leslie Martin, who was the architect for the Royal Festival Hall in London. Two eminent architects who served on the jury for an opera house competition that the gentleman in the middle is about to win. This competition was a well-organized international competition, and there were to be 2 days of judging the competition. The first day was to look at all of the entries and then prepare a short list. Unfortunately, Saarinen's flight was delayed, and he only turned up for the second morning to be confronted with the shortlisted schemes, and the jury sat down and started debating the shortlist. Saarinen, after a couple of hours of discussion, was rather disappointed with the shortlisted schemes, went over to the other side of the room to the discarded pile and searched through the discarded pile and pulled out a series of sketches. I think you possibly know where I'm going with this. And once you see this sketch, you'll have a very good idea where I'm going. Saarinen then very eloquently presented the 11 sketches, and these are the sketches. This is one of the sketches which won Johan Utzon the commission to design the Sydney Opera House. You cannot imagine anything more sketchy than this. Utzon was, to everybody's surprise, selected, a young man, and the rest is history. The Sydney Opera House the word iconic is very overused today, but if there is one building in the world that deserves the title iconic, it is the Sydney Opera House. It is probably the most important, or certainly the most recognizable building of the 20th century. Externally, it is magnificent. Internally, it is not quite as magnificent. The sails or shells significantly constrain the space available and the shapes available inside the shells. So although there is an opera house and a concert hall in there, they are not regarded as world-class buildings. The exterior is magnificent. Sadly, the interior is not of the same caliber. This opera house, though, and this architectural competition changed the face of architecture forever, and certainly the form of theatre buildings. Having started with Sydney Opera House, I'll continue with opera houses, and I'm going to present an argument that externally, opera house design has actually changed quite radically, pretty much since the Sydney Opera House. But actually, internally, inside the opera house and inside the auditorium, very little has changed in the last 380 years since opera was invented or discovered in Italy. This is probably the most classical and most traditional of opera houses, the Palais Garnier in Paris. It's located at the head of one of Baron Haussmann's grand boulevards. It is a completely over-the-top building. This was built at a time when European cities, European rulers were competing for the grandeur of their major public buildings. And in 1875, Charles Garnier, the architect, gave Paris possibly one of the most magnificent opera houses in the world. Pretty formidable building. Staatsopera in Berlin on Unter den Linden, originally built in 1844 and then rebuilt several times, most recently renovated in 2017. Standing on Unter den Linden, again, in Europe, or in mainland Europe, opera houses had a significant role in place in the city. They were on grand boulevards or in palazzos. In Britain, we've always been a bit more bashful about proclaiming our interest in the arts and culture. So the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden does not stand on a major square or palazzo. It turns its back on the Covent Garden Square, and the front entrance is on a really rather unassuming side street, Bow Street, and directly across the street was the Bow Street Police Station and Magistrates Court. We're rather bashful in England about the arts and culture. Following the Sydney Opera House, architects have introduced curves and sensuous shapes into all manner of buildings, but in particular to performing arts buildings. This is Zaha Hadid's Heydar Aliyev Centre in Baku in Azerbaijan, a wonderfully flowing composition. And this is Mad Architects' Harbin Opera House in Harbin in China. Mad Architects was formed by a young Chinese chap called Ma Yon-song, who served his apprenticeship here in London in Clerkenwell in the studio of Zaha Hadid. And you can see where he got some of his original ideas, but he has developed them and taken them way beyond Zaha's early influences. Moving inside the theatres, to finish on the exteriors, there has been real change and innovation in the exterior of buildings, from the formality of the Palais Garnier in Paris to the wonderful flowing shapes we're seeing today. Internally, I'm going to argue that very little has changed. The next 5 slides take you through the past 5 centuries. Teatro San Cassiano in Venice was built in 1635, 1637. There are no extant images of it. There are no drawings, no images. This is people's recreation of it. It's a traditional opera house. It has a stage, orchestra pit in front of the stage, between the stage and auditorium, main body of seating on either a flat floor or a very gently raked floor, and then a series of boxes, galleries and boxes stacking up to a very high flat ceiling. This has 5 levels of galleries, and Teatro San Cassiano is generally acknowledged to be the first public opera house anywhere in the world. Prior to this, in Venice, there were several private opera houses, but this was the first public opera house. It was demolished in 1812 due to recurring fires. Obviously, theatres at that time were lit by either candlelight or later gas lighting, and fires were a perpetual problem. So this is the 17th century in Venice. 18th century, La Scala, Milan, probably one of the most classic opera houses in the world. Again, behind the red fire curtain, the stage, orchestra pit, large orchestra, and then very flat floor. And in this theatre, 6 levels of boxes stacking up to the roof. The view, I can tell you, the view from these boxes up here, you can see the orchestra pit, but you can't see very much of the stage. The Royal Opera House in Covent Garden, our own opera house, follows very much the same form. And here you can see in the balconies what we call the horseshoe shape. If you trace these balconies round, they are narrower at the front of the room at the stage and widen out as you move back in the auditorium. And the horseshoe shape over the last 300 years has become the classic shape for an opera house. Coming into the 20th century, Glyndebourne Opera in Sussex, 1994, a very similar shape, not as many galleries, but still 3 galleries around the room, about 1,000, just over 1,000 seats in this opera house. And then coming into the 21st century, the Opera House in Oslo, Norway, the same fundamental shape for the auditorium. Seats wrapping down the sides of the room, galleries stacking up, to a high level in the auditorium. And this early Venetian form, it seems to work, and people are still using the same form today. A generic diagram, plan and section of the Opera House. In the plan here, you can see this horseshoe shape of galleries wrapping around the main body of seating, orchestra pit and stage, a large stage, 2 side stages and a rear stage, and then in section, galleries stacking up in the room. Not all modern opera houses have the curvaceous shapes of Sydney, Baku, and Harbin. This is Snøhette's Oslo Opera House, opened in 2008. I was privileged to work with Snøhette on this project for about 10 years. It is an extraordinary piece of architecture which rises gradually from the fjord. And this surface, you can walk right up the roof of the building, up, turn back on yourself, and stand on top of the building, on top of the auditorium, looking out over the fjord. On opening night, 3 members of the Norwegian Parliament walked down to the water's edge, stripped off, and went for a swim in the fjord. It was a bit warmer. This is the opening night was in June. It's a bit colder in this photograph. The foyers, top left, bright, airy foyers, and bottom right, these are the toilets designed by Icelandic architect Olafur Eliasson, who designed the Sun project at Tate Modern some years ago. These are probably the most stylish toilets I've ever seen in a theatre building. This animation illustrates some of the technologies that go into a modern opera house. Typically, about 20 to 25% of the cost of an opera house is in the equipment and the machinery. The lighting, the sound systems, the acoustic systems. Here you're seeing the flying system lifting a cloth out of the overhead gantry, and a complex series of elevators, revolves, and wagons in the main floor. Scenery can be loaded onto elevators and taken down below the stage 8 meters into an underground store for it to reappear at a later point in the opera. Revolving stage on a wagon can move right down stage and rotate, and then track back out of sight when no longer required. And the scenery can be brought up from below. This goes on for quite a while, so I'm going to move on now. There have been experiments over the last sort of 70 years with different forms of opera house. The Teatro Regio, the Royal Theatre in Turin, the original building burnt down in about 1936. And because of intervening wars and economic problems, it took until 1971 before a new theatre was built in Italy, designed by architect Carlo Marino. Marino traveled all over the world looking for inspiration for his opera house. He wanted to do something different from the traditional Italian opera house. He realized you needed boxes. It was pretty much mandatory to put in boxes, but he only put in one level of boxes. And this results in the theatre in the opera house in Turin having a relatively low ceiling, which compromises the acoustics somewhat. At the time he was designing this in the 60s, and basically in the 60s, there was much more attention and concern about sight lines in an auditorium. So the main body of seating has a much steeper rake. This again works to the detriment of good acoustics. A singer on stage is confronted by a sea of people all sitting there. We as people are absorbent. We're wearing clothes which absorb sound and music. And the result is this is a very dry acoustic. It is actually not a very suitable acoustic for opera. And this was combined with Molino designing a most extraordinary purple proscenium arch, inspired by the Radio City Music Hall in New York, which normally houses the Rockettes, rather than the Radio City Rockettes, rather than opera. The people of Turin love their opera house because they have something which is totally different from any other opera house in Italy. It is wonderful. It's a wonderful innovation. It is not, however, the greatest opera house in Italy. Paris has two opera houses, one of which, the Palais Garnier, we looked at earlier, is magnificent. The second is the Opera Bastille, designed as one of France's grand projets and opened in 1989. This was intended to be a people's opera house. Unfortunately, it is a bland space. Personally, I think this auditorium, this view, it's got all of the charm of a modern, rather dreary airline terminal. I mentioned earlier the Harbin Opera House, work of Ma Yon-song and Mand architects. The interior feels like it's carved out of a block of wood. It's still got the audience stacked up, not quite galleries, but little boxes of seating here and there. So far I haven't visited this theatre, and I would love to go and see what it's like in reality. Incidentally, I am going to ask you a question at the end of this evening. I would like any of you to suggest which of these buildings you would most like to visit. Moving from opera houses to concert halls and rooms for music, I'm arguing, or I have argued, that little has changed in the design of opera houses, and for hundreds of years, little changed in the design of concert halls until 1963, when the Berlin Philharmonie was opened. Most traditional rooms for music followed pretty much the same format. They were very high, which is very good for acoustics. It allows the music to roll around the room and blend. They had parallel side walls, orchestra on a raised platform at one end of the room, often with a pipe organ behind, and the audience either on a completely flat floor or a very gently raked floor. This was the Hanover Square concert rooms in London, 1770s. The Haydn Saal in the Esterhazy Castle in Austria, 1803. Again, showing the same parallel side walls, high, relatively flat ceiling. The Musikverein in Vienna is regarded by many knowledgeable people and acoustic consultants as being probably the best concert hall in the world. It's a classic shoebox. This is what we call a shoebox concert hall. Parallel side walls, high flat ceiling, audience on an almost unraked floor, and shallow galleries around the sides of the room, platform, and then organ at the end. One of the reasons this room is so good is it's very small. It seats about 1,600 people. If it was reseated to modern day standards of comfort and safety, it would probably seat about 1,200 people. So in acoustics and in concert halls, small is beautiful, as Schumacher said about a different sort of equation. Symphony Hall in Boston, 1900, follows the same format, different style of building, but a very, very similar shape. This is a generic diagram of that concert, of this sort of shoebox concert hall. parallel side walls, orchestra at one end, shallow galleries around the room, and then a high room with a flat ceiling. High to get the volume. In a concert hall like this, you need around 10 cubic meters per person to get a rich acoustic for a symphony concert. For several hundred years, the shoebox dominated. All that changed in 1963 when Hans Scharoun designed a new home for the Berlin Philharmonie. At that time, it was Herbert von Karajan had just retired as conductor of the Philharmonie, and Scharoun and Karajan and the client worked together to design a completely new form of concert hall. The exterior of the building is a wonderful, the exuberant space, exterior, on the edge of the Tiergarten in the middle of Berlin. Internally, the audience is broken up into smaller groups of seating. And Scharoun wanted to divide the audience up and create small blocks. Typically, there are about 100, 120, 130 people in each of these blocks. He wanted the size of the blocks to replicate that of an orchestra, 100, 120 people. And this is it with the audience taken out of the space. The audience surrounds the players on stage, makes for a much more intimate and visually exciting room. This was 1963, and this has become the most popular form of room for music today. Most modern concert halls follow this form, a little bit controversially. So on the left, the shoebox concert hall, and on the right, the surround hall, which Scharoun, I'll go back one slide. Scharoun coined the expression vineyard for this type of hall. It's like a French or Swedish or Austrian vineyard with little pockets of vineyards stepping up the mountainside. As I said, this has been adopted as a form and taken up in many parts of the world. This is Arata Isasaki's Shanghai Symphony Hall. It's a clean, very elegant room. Personally, I find this a little bit bland. It's a little bit too refined. It's in China. I'm not suggesting we should have Chinese dragons or lanterns or red, but it does call out for a sort of pipe organ at the back of the stage, of the platform, rather than this sort of rather uniform color scheme. In Los Angeles, the Disney Concert Hall was designed by Frank Gehry. The Disney family gave a major gift in order to pay for the hall. And externally, you can see the wonderfully curvaceous titanium panels, so typical of Frank Gehry's architecture. Internally, the audience surrounds the platform. Gehry introduced natural light into the room. Many old concert halls had windows or natural light. Gehry reintroduced them in the Disney Concert Hall. This is a close-up top left of the pipe organ. This is truly extraordinary pipe organ. Nobody knows where Gehry got his inspiration from this organ, but I have my suspicions. More recently, in 2017, Swiss architects Herzog and de Meuron designed the Elbe Philharmonie. Herzog and de Meuron, I've again had the privilege to work with them, are possibly the most interesting architects working in the world today. They go back to basics on every project. As a consultant, they are a pain in the neck to work with because they question and query everything, but the end result is often extraordinary. This is the Philharmonie in Hamburg. It's possibly the most recent of the surround vineyard concert halls. You can see the basic principles, audience broken up into different blocks. Something they did in this room is connect all of the blocks together with staircases. Basically, if you are inside this auditorium, you can move between levels. If you see a friend somewhere else in the auditorium, you can move around and find your way to them. As I said, since Sharon invented or designed the first surround hall, Vineyard Hall, it has become the norm. It is still quite controversial. There are an awful lot of people sitting either behind or at the side of the concert platform. And these people get a completely different, a quite different acoustic experience from the audience sitting in front of the platform. And many acoustic consultants would argue that if acoustics are the only requirement, then a shoebox or more traditional concert hall will provide a more consistent and a more even acoustic environment. But visually, going to a concert is not just about listening, it is a visual experience as well. Visually, as you can see from these two photographs, this sort of room tends to be the most exciting visual space. Rather bizarrely, the Hamburg Concert Hall is built on top of a massive brick warehouse building in Hamburg docks. This warehouse building was described as is described as a heritage building, which personally I find a little bit offensive, because the building was only built in 1955. And as I was born before 1955, possibly like many of the people on this call, we do not think of ourselves as heritage. But in Germany, this is a heritage building. So the whole Herzog and de Meuron created on top of the building, 9 floors in the air, a complete plaza level, and then the 2 concert halls, the concert hall and recital hall, are in this wonderful shape above. In Miami, Frank Gehry was the architect for the New World Center. This was a concert hall, small concert hall, 780 seats, designed for Michael Tilson Thomas, the conductor, and his New World Symphony Orchestra. The New World Symphony Orchestra is a training orchestra for young musicians. They will have graduated from perhaps the Juilliard School, Royal Academy of Music, and in order to get their first job in an orchestra, they need to have experience of playing in an orchestra. And the New World Center is essentially a training orchestra for young musicians. The building externally has none of the sort of showmanship of many Frank Gehry's buildings. It's a relatively conventional box. It, however, has a 7,000 square foot video wall on one side of the building, so any event presented inside the concert hall can also be broadcast to an audience in the park outside. The audience outside, you can accommodate about 2,000 people sitting on the grass. This is Miami, so there is a wonderful climate most of the year round. Inside the room, it's a sort of surround hall. There are blocks of seating around the platform. As I said, it's only about 780 seats. Overhead, there are a series of very large acoustic reflectors, each of which is a projection screen, and you can, in this room, project any illusion onto the surfaces around. So you can mix media. This is one of the most wired buildings for music anywhere in the world. The final room I want to show for music is also a Frank Gehry building in Berlin, the Boulez Saal, named after Pierre Boulez. the composer and conductor. And this building was an inspiration of Daniel Libeskind, the eminent conductor who works in Berlin. This building, this structure was built into a found space. It's built into a room about 24 by 26 meters, which was actually the original scenery store for the Staatsoper in Berlin. Geary and his team created this elliptical space. All of the seating on the main floor is flexible. Blocks of seating can be removed. You can have the stage in the middle of the room, or at one end or one side of the room. And then it is surrounded by this wonderful sweeping balcony, which sort of rises and falls in a most sensuous fashion. This again is a small room, about 700 seats, 750 seats, and a really exciting space in which to see music. It's time to move on to playhouses, thrust stages, theatre in the round, and other experiments. Stratford, Ontario has only one thing in common with Stratford-upon-Avon, and that is the name. During the 50s, the traditional industries in Stratford, Ontario were declining. It has had a very major industrial base. And as part of the process of reinventing the town, a group of people decided they thought it might be a good idea to start a theatre festival. And they did. In the mid-50s, they staged a festival of Shakespeare's work in tents in Stratford, Ontario. This was very, very successful, and they decided to build a permanent building inspired in some ways by the theatres of Shakespeare's time, with a thrust stage, the audience wrapping round three sides of the stage. And this festival theatre in Stratford, Ontario was incredibly successful, was and continues to be incredibly successful. The theatre was designed in partnership with set designer Tanya Mazerevich and has inspired several other theatres in Minneapolis, the Chichester Festival Theatre in the south of England, and possibly most famously, the Crucible Theatre in Sheffield in England. Again, designed by Renton Howard Wood Levine, again with Tanya Mazerevich as an advisor. This is a quite old photograph, which is rather blurred, I'm afraid, of the building at its opening. Thrust stage, audience on three sides, about 1,000 seats. The Crucible in Sheffield has become more famous possibly for hosting the World Snooker Championships than for its theatrical activities. The Snooker Championships, I think, run over about 2 weeks. And on one occasion when I visited the theatre, I was told by the general manager that in those 2 weeks, they sell more beer than they sell in the other 50 weeks of the year. And the snooker pays for and subsidizes the cultural activities of the theatre. Frank Lloyd Wright was probably one of the most famous architects of the 20th century, certainly the most famous American architects of the 20th century. And he died in April 1959. Sadly, he died a few months before 2 of his buildings opened. They both opened to some controversy, and one, the Guggenheim Museum, as you can see in this photograph, went on to become one of the most acclaimed buildings in the world. When the Guggenheim opened, this building breaks every rule of museum buildings in the world. The walls are curved. The ceilings are at an angle, they slope. The floors slope. Museum curators and directors initially hated it. It was very, very controversial. But the public loved it. You enter the building, you take an elevator up to the top of this extraordinary spiral ramp and walk gently down the spiral ramp, looking at the artwork and looking across the atrium to the public and the exhibits opposite. So in 1959, sadly, Frank Lloyd Wright died about 6 months before this building was opened, and he never saw the acclaim for the building. A couple of months after that, another building opened by Frank Lloyd Wright, which did not get the same acclaim. The Kalita Humphreys Theatre in Dallas, Texas, opened in about December of that year, and it was an experiment, and Lloyd Wright had some rather strange ideas. He decided it should have a circular stage, and that on either side of the stage, there would be ramps up to the stage from the workshops below. And his concept was that scenery would be brought up the ramps onto the stage for a scene, and then taken down the ramp on the other side back to the workshops below. This was a pretty bizarre idea, which never worked. Very gentle rake on the seating, a ceiling which is much too low. The room is actually quite claustrophobic, and totally inadequate lighting positions overhead. This was built for the Dallas Theatre Center, one of America's leading professional theatre companies. They have inherited a Frank Lloyd Wright building, which is a nightmare to work in. They struggled in this building, they continue to struggle and use the building, but yearned for a more flexible auditorium. And eventually, 2009, a new theatre was built, the D. and Charles Wiley Theatre. This is the auditorium. I've got an animation of this, but unfortunately, when we tried it out earlier, it wouldn't work. The auditorium is glazed. There are blinds, you can eliminate the natural light, but everything you see in this room, all of the seating, everything on the floor, all of these seating towers can move. Having been given a completely inflexible and difficult to use theatre by Frank Lloyd Wright, they decided to go to the complete opposite extreme and build an extraordinarily flexible space. And this is it. This is the animation. Everything you see in this picture can move. In 1961, the arena stage was built in Washington, D.C. Americans use the expression arena stage. We tend to say theatre in the round, meaning the audience is on all four sides, wraps round a small central acting area. And the arena stage was truly innovative at the time it was built in Washington. Small, intimate, very focused. It inspired dozens and dozens of theatres in university campuses all across America. The black and white photograph was the building as originally constructed. It was renovated about 8 or 9 years ago, and you can see the photograph result bottom right. Virtually nothing was changed. Everything about the room worked so well. There were technical improvements, there were some improvements, but the room is largely untouched. A second theatre in round is the Royal Exchange Theatre in Manchester. The Royal Exchange in Manchester, as you can see on the left of the picture, was the Cotton Exchange. There was a huge board, which is still there, displaying the prices of cotton. And a huge volume space, a flat floor for the traders. The Royal Exchange building, in its naked form, has a reverberation time or an echo of about 14 seconds. It's such a large building. A theatre company, the 69 Theatre Company, were offered this space to create a theatre in it. And they built a temporary, and this is not a photograph of a temporary theatre, they built a temporary theatre out of scaffolding before having Levitt Bernstein design a permanent structure for them. And the plan and section are on the right. They created a 7-sided structure with gallery seating inside a glass module. This is 76, and at the time, of course, the first landings were taking place on the moon, so this became known as the sort of lunar module in the middle of the Royal Exchange. The Royal Exchange has 3 wonderful glass domes overhead, and here you can see the module. Because of the reverberation time in the room, it was necessary to glass enclose the theatre module to enable good acoustics for theatre. Very high-tech structure. It had to be carried on structural frames spanning across the room because the main floor of the hall couldn't stand the weight of a new theatre structure. Inside the theatre, there are 2 galleries of seating, 7-sided, and seating either on the main floor, on low benches, and then regular chairs, and then high chairs at the back. This room seats about 700 people. Nobody in the room is more than 11 meters from the center of the stage. It is probably one of the most intimate and exciting rooms for theatre in the UK. Another experiment was the Schaubühne in Berlin. The Schaubühne was originally built in the 1920s by Erich Mendelsohn as architect. This is one of his sketches, top left. It was built as a cinema, the Universal Cinema, badly damaged during the war. It was renovated and rebuilt in 1981 as the Schaubühne, and they decided to create an incredibly flexible space in there. It could be divided into 3 different spaces, all used as a single space. It is a very German, very heavily engineered auditorium with huge elevators to raise and lower. It is a wonderfully innovative experiment. It's one of those experiments which people should do somewhere in the world, and then learn the lessons from it and probably not repeat it. And because it's Germany, it has huge subsidy and they can afford to operate the building. A second flexible theatre, another flexible theatre closer to home, is the Bridge Theatre down on the South Bank. The seating can be arranged in a number of different configurations. And bottom right, you can see it in a fairly conventional arrangement with an end stage and the main bodies of seating looking at the stage, and 3 galleries of seating down the side walls and at the rear of the room. It is a nice auditorium in this form, but they have done a couple of productions where they have taken out all of the seating, put a central stage. This is a production by Nick Heitner of A Midsummer Night's Dream. It is much more exciting in this form than in the more conventional forms. And I'd be really interested later on to see if any of you have visited the Bridge Theatre. A truly bizarre theatre is the Shed in New York, part of a redevelopment of the Hudson's Yard area in New York City. The Shed, this huge envelope you see here, can retract and cover the main structure, leaving a large open area for outdoor performances, or the structure can move forward and create the venue you see bottom right for an audience of about 1,200 people. It is an incredibly high space, a truly bizarre experiment. It's a good thing it was in New York because they were able to raise over $400 million to build it, and they can also afford the large subsidy to run the building. This is the animation, which sadly isn't going to run this evening. I'm getting to the end, you'll be pleased to hear. I'd like to say something about performing arts buildings in the city. We come back to the Garnier Opera House in Paris, and this is very typical of traditional theatres, concert halls and opera house, a very formidable, formal and forbidding approach. It's not an approach that welcomes all sections of the community. You have to be a fairly confident member of the aristocracy or the middle class or upper class to go to this sort of building. All that changed in 1944 in Malmö in southern Sweden. As far as I know, only one theatre opened during the Second World War. Sweden was neutral, and on the 23rd of September 1944, while Copenhagen, some 25 miles away, was still an occupied city, the Statstheater in Malmö opened with a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. But the facade of the building was at that time unique. You can see there is an almost entirely glass facade. There is a Swedish spirit of openness, that this became a transparent building. And this was truly inspirational. After the war, many architects, the architects for the Festival Hall in London visited it. Most importantly, Walter Runa from Germany designed the music theatre in Gelsenkirchen and made the whole exterior of the building, the whole facade of the building glass, and the staircase effectively a piece of theatre in its own right. The Festival Hall in London has some of the same openness and transparency, made even more open in 2017 when it developed so much retail and restaurant space around the building. This spirit of openness was not universal. The Deutsche Oper in Berlin, 1961, is probably the most dreary exterior of any theatre building in the world. Also in Berlin, the Staatsoper. This had a huge renovation in 2017. About 600 million euros was spent on the renovation, and it's all internal. It's to do with the auditorium, the foyers, and particularly the stage technologies. No attempt was made to make the exterior more open and more welcoming. It is a pretty, if the Kaiser came back tomorrow, he would recognize this building. Ironically, there's a huge square next to the building where something modern and innovative could have been put. It possibly takes the confidence of the French to take the Louvre, their grandest museum, and put a pyramid entrance into it, designed by a Chinese American architect, I.M. Pei. It's a wonderfully bold intervention. The Staatsoper in Unter den Linden should have had some similar inspired piece of architecture there. I'm going to close with, in the year 2017, I was involved in 2 theatre buildings just before I retired. The first is in Shanghai. It's the Shanghai Opera House. This is a huge building. I was responsible for writing the brief for this building and then acted as an advisor to the jury for the architectural competition. 6 architects entered the competition, were shortlisted rather, and Snøhetta were the winning architects. This is a huge building of about 130,000 square meters, and with a cost of around $1.3 billion. As a consultant, I am very good at spending other people's money. I specialize in spending other people's money. This is my house in Slovenia, a modest house. The white are not gravestones. These are vines that I'm growing there. And I decided to build an amphitheatre in the grounds of my house, mainly because I've got this fabulous view. This is the smallest theatre I've ever worked on. It accommodates 20 people. In this case, I was the client, not the consultant. As a consultant, I'm good at spending other people's money. As a client, this theatre cost €400 for the excavation and a further €20 for the seats. And every summer, I have one or two concerts in the garden of my house in Slovenia. Thank you very much indeed for your patience this evening. It's a great pleasure to speak with you.